welcome again, re-welcome if you've been here, to the final day, I know, shocking, the final day of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan. It's been a real pleasure to have all of you with us this weekend, whether you're coming just for this event or you've been here with us for the past few days. And a special welcome to those of you viewing from parts all over the globe via our festival live stream. This event means a lot to me. Like many of you in this room, I've been reading, dreaming, and envisioning within the work of Christina Sharpe for a long time. And it's thrilling for me personally, and I know for those of us assembled here, to have her at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, to collectively be with her and be with her thinking. In her new book, Ordinary Notes, Christina Sharpe steps past conventions of academic scholarship and literary genre to explore public and private histories, Blackness, language, memory, and the power of art. And we could think of no finer person to be in conversation with Christina today than scholar, feminist activist herself, Gabrielle Hosein. I know you're going to glean so much from this session, and I can't wait to see how it unfolds. Please welcome Christina and Gabrielle.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Christina. Welcome to Bocas. I think there's a lot of people that are looking forward to hearing you read from your work in Trinidad and Tobago here at Bocas. And it's incredibly political. It's incredibly tender. When I read it sometimes as music, as notes as different notes creating a song, and sometimes as a chorus comprising many voices. So I'd like to invite you now to read from your work.
Thank you so much, and it's really an honor and a deep pleasure to be here. Thank you, Shivani, for that lovely introduction. I was a judge in 2022, and of course, the festival happened remotely, and so it's really a deep pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to read 4 notes to begin. Note 1. Oh, sorry, no, I'm not going to read note 1. I read note 1 yesterday, okay. Note 2. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, it is high man with his high at dawn and the ho when evening came, who takes on the responsibility to interrupt the particular violence of the daily morning rapes. The armed white men's demand for fellatio from one or some or all of the black men who make up that prison gang in Alfred, Georgia. High man's daily calls are an interruption, not an end. His morning calls redirect the violence of rape to the violence of other captive labor. To be a black man and to arrive on the line another morning is to have lived with and through all of these violences. Put another way, high man's calls do not immediately change the fact of his imprisonment or their own, but they do change the atmosphere. His held note establishes a connection among the men. When the deluge comes, it almost kills the black men underground, in the mud and water, in their cages cum graves, locked there by the white men who hold the keys. The trust and care established through high man's ordinary note provides the means through which Paul D. and the 45 other men held not only in chattel slavery, but also in a prison labor camp, grab onto those 1,000 feet of hand-forged chain, hold on to each other, plunge into, up, and out through the mud, and escape that prison/grave/ship in Alfred, Georgia. With that note, they are held. Note 3, quote, "The past, or more accurately, pastness," Michel Roth-Troyot tells us, "is a position," end quote. Several years ago, when we were in Erlangen, Germany, R and I went to the Nazi Documentation Center and Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. By the time we left, after watching the films and viewing the installations and the displays of photographs, books, racist games, and more, we were convinced that depending on where one stood, this memorialization would actually attract people to Nazism. The objects function as memorabilia, as a memorialization, not of the wounded, but of the perpetrator. We observed the other people at the center. Some of their faces were filled with admiration for the brutalities of white nationhood and the call of white supremacy. They were lit with an emotion that was neither horror at the perpetrators nor sympathy for the victims. The visual and sonic repetitions in the documentation center may now be, or may have always been, incapable of doing the work of never again that in their installation they were intended to do. We saw in them not the condemnation of the Nazis, but their glorification. And these displays enter a present in which, quote, in no way can we identify the past as past. Note 80, a moment of pure tenderness. I am in the shops at Columbus Circle in Manhattan on the up escalator, and the woman and the girl are on the down escalator. The girl is about 12, the woman in her late 40s. The girl is 2 steps in front of the woman, and as the girl looks back and up at her, the woman reaches out and touches her face. The look on the woman's face and the way that their bodies settle into the afterlife of this touch makes it seem to me that what I have witnessed is a moment of pure tenderness. All of my desires to see my mother again lodge there. I'm on the Bloor Street line in Toronto, heading home from teaching. It's a November day, mid-afternoon, and unseasonably warm. The train is stopped at Finch West Station, and when I look out the window, I see a little girl, about 8 or 9. She's walking with a woman and a boy who appears to be slightly older than she. The girl leans forward as she walks, and the strap of her school bag is slung across her forehead. You know how little kids do that. They put the bag and then they... So the strap of her school bag is slung across her forehead. The bag hangs down her back. This tenderness in what I've seen. And I'll read one final note. Note 96, Tate Modern, London, England, March 22nd, 2018. I meet a friend at the Tate Modern. Y is an art historian, a writer, and a teacher from South Africa who lives and works in London. We've known each other for several years, but we're meeting in person for the first time. We go to see the Joan Jonas exhibition that had been at the Venice Biennale, and we walk through the other galleries, and then we decide to get coffee at the cafe. It's sunny and crowded, but I see a table emptying, and I head toward it. I pass a young black woman clearing the tables, and I pause in order to speak to her. I say, hello, how are you today? The young woman stops. She looks at me, and then she asks, I'm sorry. When she doesn't respond, I look at her, and I say again, good afternoon, how are you today? The young woman stops. She looks at me, and then she asks if I'm speaking to her, and I say yes, and that I was asking how she was, and she says, I have been working here for months, and you are the first person who has ever spoken to me to ask me how I am doing. I want to thank you for that, for seeing me and asking about me. You must be kidding me, I say, although I know she is not kidding, and I am also not surprised. We are at the Tate Modern, and I have seen very few black people here. It's always like this. I say, I see you. She says, I know. I say, we see each other. She says, yes, yes, we do. This exchange reverberated throughout that day and the days that followed.
Thank you for those notes, both citing literature, citing your critique of memorials and museum work in different ways, and also bringing in the kinds of intimacy and recognition that flows through these pages. The book is about quotidian, everyday forms of violent black subjectification, how people are made into objects of through a colonial and white supremacist gaze repeatedly, and its wounds. In the wake of African enslavement, and its legacy in the US, very alive legacy. At the same time, even in the passages that you read, the notes that you read, it's also about care, beauty, regard, imagination, and love as the medicine for those wounds. Not everyone in the Caribbean may be as familiar with your work, but your earlier book, In the Wake, is absolutely central. It's called In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, and it's absolutely central, as many of your other pieces of writing, in understanding how much you are enacting here. Could you talk a little bit? In the Wake, you describe wake work as plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday of Black imminent and imminent death, and in tracking the ways that we resist, rupture, and disrupt that imminence and imminence aesthetically and materially. Can you talk about how this book for you is an enactment of wake work?
Thank you for those for that question, for that framing. I think in the Wake, I really wanted to write about, and I know I said this yesterday, but there may be overlap and there may not be, that there's a sentence that I repeat 3 times in the Wake, in kind of different forms, and that is that we Black people are produced through and by unrelenting violence, but we are not known only to ourselves and to each other by that violence. And so in the Wake, I work through some of those forms of violence under the names of the wake, the hold, the ship, the weather, but also how we produce something else that is in excess of that violence, even under those conditions that so often produce our death, that produce our wounding, but also that we survive and that we rupture and make something else from. And so one of the things that I kept thinking about as I wrote In the Wake, but I don't really speak to, and so I'll say this I'm a very long-winded answerer. So I'll think about, yesterday Dion Brand said something about that, the failure of each book, which is an opportunity to do something else. And so, and that failure is not a kind of self-flagellation, but you write the book that you can write at the time, and that then the next book is an opportunity to begin from there. So one of the things I would talk about all the time when I talked about In the Wake was something I wanted to call regard, as a kind of alongside care, but perhaps also slightly different. And so I wanted to think about Ordinary Notes as enacting a kind of regard, which is a kind of mutual recognition. And I see you and you see me, and from there we might do something in the context of forces that try to unmake us every day, right? I'm sorry to quote Dion again, but there's that moment in Ossuaries, I think it's in Ossuaries, I don't know though, so forgive me, that, no, actually maybe it's in, I don't know. We don't expect the violence of glances, the dress, well, sorry, I've just butchered the line, but it's about the things you expect when you step outside, but then the kind of things that startle you with their kind of virulent anti-Blackness. But in the midst of all that, we might enact something else which attends to each other, not in a kind of simplistic or way, but in a way that is a kind of recognition of our situation and what that recognition might allow for us to do to catch each other in moments of extreme violence or quotidian violence. So a long-winded answer, but I hoped that this book would kind of enact the knowledges that Black people have about where and how we live and how we make something in the face of all that is in excess of those violences. We experience beauty, we make music, we read, we write, we dance, we can, extend a look that says, like that note that High Man gives, which does not change our condition, but lets us know that we are not in that condition alone.
Yeah. So I do have questions, but I wanted to follow up on this one in particular, which is that conversation that you're having consistently back and forth. So the book comprises 248 notes Some of the notes can be one line, and some of them can be more than one page or a few pages. And it also comprises images as well, a vast range of images. Some of public spaces and monuments, some are very personal images. But just to pick up on what you're saying for a second, there's a very critical attention to brutality in its imperceptible ways that are nonetheless perceived, but are so ordinary. And in past interviews, you've talked about the violence of reasonableness. That is, they appear so excusable and as part of the fabric of the everyday, but they are brutal nonetheless. And then there is a tension with what I find you're often bringing, which is an attention to the breathing, the life of Black radiance. Again, breath is so almost imperceptible, ordinary, daily. Can you talk about how you try to navigate that with such care in this book, so that you leave with a sense of its horror, but you also leave with a sense that there is a breath that is going to carry you through?
Again, thank you, and I thank you for that, because I think sometimes when, and I say even within the wake or monstrous intimacies, there's a way that people can land in kind of thinking about the violence that we are subjected to, and completely miss the attempts to not reproduce it and to produce something that, as I keep saying, is in excess of it, that is that is lived alongside it, or that has, I've recently rewatched Steve McQueen's Lover's Rock, and I'm going to use Lover's Rock as a way to speak about this, the way that, that kind of beauty of that. How many of you have seen the Small Axe Lover's Rock? So you know what I'm talking, right? That sort of beauty of that interior, where that violence is right outside, but Steve McQueen never takes us to that violence. And so you have this kind of beauty being made, that joy when they're singing silly games. And that white violence is what's actually shaping that room in a sense, but it is not shaping the interactions in that room. But, the color bars are part of what makes that room necessary, as well as a delight, right? So I'm always trying to think about the kind of knowledge that, yes, we know the conditions under which we live. We think about these conditions, and we are also living our lives. Of course, there are those of us who do not survive it, and we carry the memories of those who do not survive it with us, and we understand the conditions that have produced their deaths, and we still try to live. And so I'm trying to navigate that, and to say that, that our lives may be constrained, and are indeed constrained in many ways by all kinds of strictures and enclosures, but we also make something there. And that, thinking about breathing, there are all these machines that are calibrated to kind of mismeasure Black breath. But nonetheless, we can, attend to each other. We can make spaces, and we do make spaces in which we are able to breathe, like Bocas is a space in which we can breathe, in which we can share work and, make spaces for people to produce new work.
Thank you for that. I had one list of questions, but I'm just throwing them aside to follow your. We're going to follow your footsteps in the stand. Christina, may I invite you? I don't know if you'd be okay with this, but to read note 10, page 17, which begins very beautifully with "My mother was observant as a."
This is going to be hard, but I will read it. There are notes that I don't read out loud for reasons, but I will read this one.
As a beginning to follow up.
Yeah. Note 10. My mother was observant. I had left the almost all-white Catholic elementary school and had spent 7th grade in a public junior high school that had a small number of Black students. She took me aside one day when I was in the 8th grade because she saw that after an outing or a party or a gathering at the house of a white friend, I would come home upset. She knew that my white peers and friends would soon start dating. She told me that the group of friends that I had made were kind and well-meaning, and that this group of girls were good friends to me, that they cared for me as much as I cared for them. She asked me questions, and she listened to what I said and to what I did not say. And then she told me something that she was afraid would hurt me, but that she wanted and needed me to hear. She said that with the onset of dating in their lives, she was concerned that I would either be left out or be included in ways that I would not want to be. She said that she wanted and needed me to know this. She told me that she thought from the things that I had told her that I was not unaware of what she said, but she wanted me to have the knowledge I needed to make a choice. She wanted me to know that I had choices. This telling set into motion a series of events that fundamentally changed me. My mother wanted me to build a life that was nourishing and Black. My mother wanted me to live in spaces where I would be reflected back to myself without particular distortions. She spared me tremendous pain. This Black note changed the course of my life.
Thank you for that, and thank you for agreeing to read it.
Oh, yeah.
Should we just take a moment to...
Well, I can tell you another story that's not in here, and that's, 17 magazine, which I don't even know if it still exists. But when I was nobody read 17 when they were 17. I read it when I was 12, right? You'd go to the supermarket and be like, oh, there's a new 17. So I would buy the 17. And, there were no Black people in 17 at that time. The closest was this girl called, what's her name? Phoebe Cates. And she wasn't Black, but she had brown hair. I was like, that's as close as we got to Black for 17. But I would bring it home, and then my mother one day took me aside, and she was like, she called me Tina. She was like, Tina, you know that every time you get 17, you start to feel bad about yourself, right? And I was like, no, I didn't really realize that. And she was like, I'm not going to tell you not to buy it, but, do notice the connection. So, we couldn't always talk about everything, but there were certain things that she was really good at trying to spare me certain kinds of pain. I still bought 17 for it, but I was much less critical of myself in the buying of it, right? So those kinds of things.
Thank you for that. When I saw this, so much of this book is very intimate and tender, and you put so much of yourself out there into it that I think it's one of the things that helps others to connect it. So in that one reading, one can connect it as a Black little girl growing up. Such a common experience in the Caribbean, even up to today, where we have debates about hair and schooling. Still, these are very alive debates in Trinidad and Tobago, and horrors that children are going through. I myself am the mother to a little girl that is Dogla, but appears Black and have these. So I was struck by a line in this, which is the last line, which is, this Black note changed the course of my life, and how important your mother and her various legacies were to the production of so much that you end up putting into this book.
I mean, that's really interesting. I was really moved earlier today by the conversation with Edwidge Dantica, and I think she gave me another kind of language to think about some of this book, which is, as I say at the very end, a love letter to my mother. And what she said was that, writing Brother, I'm Dying, how she couldn't wait to get to the page because it was the way that she could continue to kind of be with her father and her uncle. And I thought that was such a beautiful, beautiful way to think about it. And I told her when she left that 2 weeks ago I was rereading Brother, I'm Dying and just crying on the plane because you feel that in the context of the book. And I think, that this was something about, my mother's been dead for almost 30 years. So it's a kind of extension of my relationship. And my realization, I think, kind of belatedly, that certain things that my mother did really were a praxis. They really were a way of navigating in the wake of slavery and in the midst of violence that I learned, but learned as as a practice, but not as a praxis. And I think she really did have a theory and a practice about how to live in the world in the midst of deep, violence.
So to draw on that, you spend quite a bit of time in Ordinary Notes on beauty as a method. Beauty as a method for care in the noise of structural precarity. And you do spend time on it. You spend time on taking photographs of things from your childhood, particularly your mother's objects related to her sewing and so on, her dresses that she made for you. But there's also an attention to beauty as method in terms of passages you quote from, the definitions that you bring from others that are meant to be life-affirming, and so on. Can you talk about just drawing on this legacy that your mother left, the flowers that you would bring in, on how beauty as a method for care in the noise of structural precarity just fills the pages of this book?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the piece that's in the book, Beauty as a Method, I wrote originally, and then in a way it has become one of the centers of the book for Simone Lee's first loophole of retreat. That was at the Guggenheim Museum in 2019. And a few years before, I was moving and I came across this little box, and it had these hearts in it that my mother was making, and it had a little square, a little circle of felt with pins in them arranged. And I had completely forgotten that I had these things after my mother died. And so it was this sort of rediscovery of my mother's care, the way that my mother was working on these things as she was dying. She used to make Christmas ornaments every year. And so that kind of, to be dying and to be making something to give to your children and your grandchildren seemed to me also deeply important about, how my mother tried to be in the world. And so thinking about beauty both as, a kind of as aesthetic pleasure, but also as the capacity to kind of contend with everything, so that beauty is not surface, but a kind of attempt to sort of sit with and witness all that we experience in the world. And I wanted that kind of sitting with, witnessing, and trying to act in the face of all kinds of things to be the kind of momentum of the book.
Part of it is what is attending to what one has power to do, what one has power over. And in a world in which there is so much disempowerment, beauty as a method is about finding the beauty where one can make it possible.
Right, and that beauty, can be completely, can be only in one's head, right? So it doesn't have to be manifest in the world in any kind of material way. But it's like, how did enslaved people imagine themselves into a freedom that they had never experienced? That had to be a tremendous leap from the mind into the world. And so that's also part of what I'm trying to think about in the context of beauty as a method. That, how do we live toward something else as well as living in what we're living, right? In a way that is conscious.
Yeah, and conscious is another word that you use very carefully in the work as well, in terms of being very aware of the climate of anti-Blackness and the weather, and moving with an understanding that is the hurricane in which you're situated.
Yeah. Which is not to say that then should preclude action. But, there's another line from In the Wake, which is that we Black people, we are Black people with no state to protect us. And what does it mean to know that and to act from there?
We've talked a little bit about ordinary. I'm going to come back to it in your critique of this spectacular and spectacle, but I want to go back to the note. Okay. I'm actually taking this from an interview where Canisia Lubrin, who's a fantastic writer, I'm sure she's very...
she's sitting right there.
Canisia, you giving credit to the beauty of the work, and in your response, under this between the covers,
Oh, yeah.
and in your response, you talk about Hazel Carby describing you as a forensic etymologist.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I must ask about this because you take note, and in the very beginning of the book, you break it down grammatically.
Yeah.
And there are just so many ways that you work through it. So can you talk about this forensic etymological work that is your attention to the note and noting and so on?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Hazel. I think, I like words, I like language, and I'm always drawn to words that you can, what are they called? Contronyms. I'm drawn to contronyms. Cleave can mean to tear apart or to hold together. I'm really drawn to words that allow us to work their opposites. And I think that was the case in Monstrous Intimacies. So I suppose it was the phrase monstrous intimacies, but certainly in the wake, thinking about wake, hold, ship, and weather. And then in Ordinary Notes, thinking about, part of it came to me through thinking about something that I had worked on in the wake, about that note of high man and what it makes possible. And I wanted to keep thinking what that note did, how it produced a kind of relation that allowed, in that moment when freedom was possible, that allowed those men to survive and to escape. So I wanted to think about note musically, note in terms of notation, note-taking, note in terms of a mark, for memory, and to try to keep them alive throughout the context, throughout the entire book. Because they would hopefully accumulate and bring the other meanings along with them, even in the instances I'm talking about, particularly writing, that also you would hear sound, you would think images, you would bring memory with you. So I hoped that the sort of working with note could work that way. And to think about all of the ways that, we note, we notice, we are observant of, even if we may not say so in the moment, of all of the things that are around us.
So, to follow up on that, I would like to invite you to 228. It's very short.
Page 228?
No, note. Note 228. I wondered if we could talk about reparations. So I'm trying to get as many chances for Christina to read from her book for you. To follow up on that, and quoting you, or reading from you, a black note observes and holds with care. It bears witness. It sees beyond the frame of white supremacy. It counters the consistent misrecognition in language and representation. A black note holds with care. And you've also talked about repair, reparations, and I wanted you to invite you to link care, the black note that holds with care, and the countering the misrecognition of why reparation is necessary.
And I'll say a little bit about care. And I don't know if you were going to have me read this note, but I'll narrate the note, which is to say that I recognize that care is a term that is so often used against black people, against poor people, against queer people, against disabled people, and that so often we experience or made to experience care as violence. And yet I still don't want to abandon care, because we also enact words and phrases and in our own ways. And so I haven't found something that replaces care. And so the note says something like, I want to talk about distributed risk. I want care that is a condemnation of the dead world. I want care that enacts other things. So I say that to say that when I'm thinking about black notes of care, I'm really thinking about a kind of work that undoes those kinds of structural violence, right? The way in which, you call the 911 and the police show up and murder the person who you've tried to get help for, right? They label that care. That's not what I'm talking about. Okay, so now I'll read. Note 228. In the summer of 2020, for 10 days and counting, and in the midst of a global pandemic disproportionately harming Black people, tens of thousands of Black people went into the streets to face the triple threats of COVID-19, the violence of care/no care if infected, and the always present threat of police violence, police being already itself a name for violence. People remained in the streets demanding an end to policing and all the violence that it sustains and is sustained by it. Their coming together was a manifestation of the ideas that care is shared risk and that abolition is, quote, a synonym for love, end quote. In the summer of 2020, some of the static monuments to global white supremacy were brought down. Over the course of a few days, a protester broke the right hand off a statue of Louis XVI in Louisville, Kentucky. In Bristol, England, a crowd toppled Edward Colston and threw him into the River Avon. In Richmond, Virginia, a group of young people pulled down a monument to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. This is just one example of Confederate monuments coming down. This action was repeated multiple times in the same city and in multiple cities. In Brussels, Belgium, a crowd climbed on the statue of the genocidal King Leopold II and chanted their demand for reparations.
And I want to think about this specifically in terms of Haiti for a moment,
Okay.
which you've written extensively on,
Just a little.
in the wake in particular, and how an image in the wake reminded you of why the ship remains so key. And it was an image of a Haitian girl with a piece of tape on her forehead that had the word ship, and it's just astounding that it even exists, that image. The black note that observes and holds with care, and the way it can become a note that takes hold, such that Black lives are held and held. What is the way that we can note Haiti with care, such that it's a place, Haiti is held and held?
Thank you for that. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, but I'll answer from where I sit, and that is, I think that both Mariam Chauncey and Edwidge Dantika spoke to that. But I think certainly one way is to, not reproduce the language of utter pathologization of the kind of Haiti exception in which Haiti is the space of everything that the West imagines as black. And so I think it is to, read and listen to, Haitian writers, contemporary, and the generations before, is to think with people like Michel Roth-Toyot and Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, which has been deeply transformative for how I think about monuments, how I think about history with a capital H and a small h, the Guild of Historians, about how, he has this, silence enters the archives at 4 points. I can't reproduce the 4 points for you, but one of them is the recording of history, the making of narrative, and I don't remember the other two. But it's to really pay attention to how narratives get produced and for what purpose, and to then, read the narratives that sort of counter those narratives that are produced and circulated in the present, which are all about rendering Haiti the place to which anything can be done to the people who live there. And so I think a kind of attention is a way to counter that.
Mm-hmm. An attention to continued imperialism.
Absolutely. To extraction. I mean, I think the answer to the question of why Harvesting Haiti is the title, the way that Haiti has been and continues to be harvested at the same time that the dominant narrative would have us believe that there's nothing there for the taking.
Yeah, and the sense too that Haiti should not be allowed to govern itself.
Yes, I see a hand in the back.
That Haiti should not be allowed to govern itself.
Absolutely.
And still exist in the hold.
Yes.
as property, and then
Yes.
and finally the idea that Haitians should not allow to be migrants as
That's
well.
right.
So
That's right.
in many ways, I think
That Haiti should be held, yes, in the hold, enclosed. And I remember a story that appeared in the New York Times fairly soon after the earthquake, in which cruise ships were going to Haiti. And they were telling the passengers on the cruise ship that they were going to the Dominican Republic, and and not naming it Haiti, but it was Haiti. And so, the way that Haiti can be used as a site for pleasure, but not for Haitians. It is to be a site of a narrativization of suffering, or an enactment of suffering.
Thanks for that. We have the opportunity to open it up to the audience now, to hear any questions, to invite any questions that you may have. The microphone is here. It's coming.
Thank you. I don't have a question. I just wanted to comment that note 3 brought me to remember Gaza and the whole thing of how the World War II monuments could actually elicit admiration for what Nazis did.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. Right. And yesterday, I read a note, that's I think note 169, tender, and I read it in a different form than it appears in the book, because some of the people in the note were people who survived the bombings of hospitals and homes in Gaza. So the child who's taken from the rubble and says, "Are you taking me to the cemetery?" The children who hold a press conference and say, "We want to live," were my trying to think through and attend to what is happening in the present, in Gaza, in Sudan, in the Congo, in Haiti, etc. Thank you, Margaret. Beverly Bain.
I want to thank both of you for the conversation so far. Gab, for your really thoughtful, incisive interrogation of the work, and Christina for your responses. I want to say that Ordinary Notes for me is so significant in this moment. It is so important at this time where we are witnessing, the incredible rise of fascism, the incredible rise of anti-black racism, of Islamophobia, what we are witnessing in terms of Palestine and Gaza, and the idea of care in your work and beauty all together speaks volumes in terms of, we know that care comes with risk, right? And we are seeing that, but what it also brings is a kind of sustainability and beauty that we are witnessing, and refusal that we are witnessing right now in terms of what is happening, in terms of the uprising, the resistance that we are seeing in terms of people who are pro-Palestinian and are willing to maintain and sustain, their refusal to what is happening. We are seeing this on campuses, and I think your book in this moment actually sustains me as an activist in this struggle. It helps me to understand and to keep at the center, that caring is political, that caring is risky, but caring also opens up ways to think about and to also figure out how we continue to mobilize in solidarity and in support of each other. So I want to thank you for that, Christina.
Thank you, Beverly. And that really makes me think of a moment, and I don't have it memorized, but recently, Harsha Walia, who wrote Border and Rule, had a beautiful tweet about the encampments and saying, she didn't say it quite this way, but what encampments were a practice of care and a practice of risk, and that it was another language of care, the kinds of things that were happening in the, from a library to teaching to meal preparation. An experiment in how to live otherwise is happening in our midst all the time. So thank you for that. And Ronaldo Walcott always talks about risk and that we have to risk something. And I deeply appreciate that kind of clarity as well.
Hi, Christina.
Hi.
Thanks for spending this time with us this morning, or this afternoon, sorry. I wanted to ask you about the role of the photograph in your work, because it's central in the wake and again in ordinary notes. And photographs can be places of violence themselves. They can do violence, or they can also be places where great regard is held, true regard and care. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to ask you to speak a little more deeply on the role of the photograph in your work.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. I mean, there's a note that I almost read, which is about a young man in a camp outside of Calais who is being interviewed about the fact that he's been interdicted. He's trying to get from Calais to England so he can continue his education. But he's been held in this camp now for months, and it's winter, and he doesn't have any shoes on. And he says to the photographer who's with the reporter, please don't take any photos of my clothing. They're dirty and I don't have any shoes. So what appears in the paper? A photograph of his clothing and a photograph of his feet without shoes. And so thinking about the kind of ways in which so often, particularly in relation to Black people, the photograph, even when it's supposed to instantiate something like care, actually lands in the register of abandonment. Or in the register of a kind of pathologization. And so I try, and it's over time, I've become much more careful about the kinds of images that I reproduce. So I will talk about certain images in the context of ordinary notes, but I will not reproduce those images. Or there's a photograph like Dawood Bey's Untitled No. 4 Porch and Leaves, in which there's no actual figure in the photograph, but you get a sense of all of the people, all of the enslaved people who would have walked past that porch on their way to something like freedom. So there are ways in which I try to use photographs that also give that kind of sense of presence. But yes, I mean, obviously photographs can do a lot of, can sort of hold people in a particular moment of terror. And then there are photographs that can do another kind of work. And I'll say one more thing about that. The note Tender, I tried to describe people who many of us have come to know who they are because of the worst thing that ever happened to them. And some of them we have witnessed their deaths. And so I wanted to give a description that would let us know who they were, but not have them held only in that moment of extreme violence in which they may have died or been utterly changed. So I wanted to give a sense that, just like the little girl with the word ship on her forehead, that there was a before and that there's an after. There may be an after. So I hope that answers your question. I appreciate it. I see you are a photographer, because you have your... So yeah, I mean, photos do all kinds of work, memory work, but they also hold a kind of violence and can also reproduce and spread terror.
Any other questions?
Hi. Ooh. Good afternoon. I guess I have a question about when you were talking about beauty as a method and the way that narratives shape themselves around language. When you were talking about your mother, I thought that was interesting because with West Indian mothers, when they want to say, how are you? They say you're getting fat. So I wanted to know, I guess, within beauty and imagining beauty within Black communities, because there's so many different narratives with shadism, colorism, etc. How do you see it now compared to when you were writing?
Well, I mean, I was just writing 2 years ago. Is that what you asked me? How I see it From when I was writing or when I was growing up? Okay. I'm not quite sure I follow the question, but I think what you're asking, I think one of the things that I was really interested in this book, so often, you watch a film, and I'll talk about film. So often you watch a film and the relationship between Black women and children is one of almost incipient violence. So often the kind of tenderness that we actually may experience in our relations is not represented visually. It is represented textually sometimes, many times. But I was thinking how I really wanted to think about that tenderness. This is a visual reference, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, Leon Bridges' song Rivers, and that video. And it's this, look it up if you're not familiar with it. It is a beautiful video in which, again, violence is kind of on the outskirts. It is part of what produces the language of the video, but it is not the aesthetic of the video, and it is not what happens. And so I really wanted to again, think about these kinds of relations that, they aren't always easy, but that, I wanted to think what tenderness makes, and what tenderness breaks open and allows perhaps to flourish. And so that's what I wanted to think through, acknowledging that there are many ways that we experience violence in and outside of the house. What about those moments of tenderness? How might that language be expressed, whether it's through the preparation of food, the making of a dress, the laying out of a place setting, the bringing of flowers, etc. What are the various language of tenderness that we experience and that animate our relations to our family, to our communities, etc. So thank you for the question.
I'll take one more question in the
There was
back.
a question
Yeah.
in the back.
Hi, once again. My question speaks to ordinary notes as having a deep musicality behind it. But I have often, when looking at your work, I see that you also experiment with form and structure as well. So is it that when you set out to write, that the structure speaks to you, or is it that, just like how do you speak to the structure of your work then, I guess? How do you decide what best represents what you want to say in that moment?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that each of my books has its own form, and that I think that I wanted the form of the note to kind of accumulate and make an argument through accumulation, through a kind of compression and leap. And I was really interested in books like, Adrienne Kennedy's The People Who Led to My Plays, John Keane's Annotations and Counter-Narratives, Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, and The Blue Clerk, books in which form really does something. So I wanted a kind of formal experiment in which the form could enact part of what I really wanted the book to do. And I deeply appreciate the question. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
We're getting...
And thank you. Oh, sorry. I preempted.
We're
bye.
about to wrap, but I get to at least thank Christina. We did get the 5-minute signal, but we are well within our 5 minutes. I want to let you leave us with note 81, if you would mind. And while you find it, just to say, we didn't get to discuss it, but she has a trenchant critique of memorials and museums that you should, when you read the book, and just to mention some of them, note 23, the architecture of the memorial stages encounter, but spectacle is not repair. Yeah. Every memorial and museum to atrocity already contains its failure. Note 25.
And that is, so I wrote a note 25.1, which is never again has never meant never again, which is so clear to us in the moment in which we are living, right? That never again has only ever meant never again for some people, right?
And in note 236, return the bones, return the photographs, repatriate the statues, empty the museums.
Yeah. Yes.
And then you end with the idea of antidote, just to get back to medicine, as we started with the beginning.
And I was going to thank you so much for that, for the medicine. There's a beautiful preface to Barracoon written by Alice Walker, and I'm not going to get it right, but she says something like, those who love us, show us the wound and then give us the medicine for it. Right?
So we're going to end. We're within our time. Don't worry.
We're taking our time. What is it?
I would, if
reclaiming our time.
If you don't mind reading, I would like to invite you to end with note 81.
Okay.
And to ask you as you end, what image or images lodged in you exceed the force putting and keeping breath in you?
Wow. Okay. I'm gonna read the note, and then I'm gonna answer. Note 81. Dee says the image of the ocean is lodged in her, coming from Guayguayare at the southernmost tip of Trinidad, coming from the northwest corner of a four-way intersection in Wayne, Pennsylvania. I wonder what image is lodged in me. I think the image of, we had a vegetable garden and a flower garden. Maybe the images of those gardens, and also the image of my mother's hands and what they made.
Christina Sharpe, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so very much.